Okay, well, let me just start with this then. So, right, because we're going to talk tonight, right, it's about sort of an intersection, right? There's a place that these realities come to meet. And oftentimes, everybody, where is that place? It's right here, or it's right here, where the invisible God and invisible realities that have existed before time and space and the material world that we just get so doggone used to, don't we? That invisible world meets the visible world in us, rational creatures. And we're sort of these, and I got this line here from Matt actually, we're sort of these awkward creatures caught in two worlds at the same time. Right? The angels don't have this problem. They're just pure spirit. They can freely live as well as spirit. Well, we're a body and soul composite. And so as this sort of composite, we have to work through sorting that out. What belongs to each category or type, right? So I think as we get going along here, look for things that bring clarity to what are common, what we might call category confusion or category error. So for example, here's a category error. God doesn't exist because I can't study him under a microscope. What's the category error there? Well, in that sort of premise, I'm saying a spiritual immaterial being, which we might describe as an eternal unembodied mind, doesn't exist because I can't see him. Right? My material eye can't sense this thing that by its nature is immaterial, so therefore it doesn't exist. That's what we call a category error. And a lot of people who might struggle with certainly atheism, but agnosticism, sort of confuse these types of things. Well, angels probably don't exist. Why? Have you seen anybody with wings recently? And then sometimes Christians are like, oh yeah, you're right, I guess I haven't. Right? So we want to be able to move past that. Okay? Where do we want to go? Maybe I'll ask this to you, Dan. What is the end, or the telos, right? Some of you might know this. Telos comes from the Greek, just means the end for which we're created, the goal that ultimately everything's aimed for. What, Dan, is the telos or the end of physics in modern science? Maybe give two brief descriptions. First of, like, in a modern sense, what your sense of the scientific physicist community is. What's their end? What's the goal? What are they after? And then from a traditional Christian sense, when we are approaching science, things that we can measure, mathematics, what's the telos of Christian scientists historically versus maybe historic, more secular or non-Christian scientists?
Well, I think the end of science is to understand the material world, and that is sort of a contrast with the telos, or the end of Christians, which is to achieve communion with God. And there's no sense of in science that we're moving towards the goal of communion with God or even understanding God. We're, as scientists, you're trying to understand nature and the material world. So that's one of the categories of things that science is concerned with. It's concerned with the material category of, what are things made of, how do they interact with each other, but we never, as scientists, we never talk about what is the purpose of something. Okay? And so when you ask questions about about purpose or about the ends or what is something created for, I mean, that's not a question that science even tries to answer. What was the other part of that?
Traditionally, well, you kind of answered it perhaps, but just to recap, traditionally a Christian approach to science.
Yeah, and I think a Christian approach is, a Christian scientist would recognize that everything that exists in the material world is a creature. I mean, if we had a priest up here early enough, we would have heard a blessing for, bless this creature beer or bless this creature wine. Everything that exists.
He's calling out our clergy subtly. Can you see the Catholic News headlines? Office manager calls out boss. Yeah, wow.
So I always thought that was odd to call, to call a glass of beer a creature, but it really is. A creature just means created by God. So we think of everything, as Christian scientists, we think of everything in the material world as a creature, as a creation of God. So with that in mind, we might concentrate more on why was it created? What is it for? What is its purpose? What is its end? So I think that'd be the difference.
Okay. Anything you'd want to add to that, Matt?
Just to kind of simplify that, I guess a Christian scientist should be asking the question, well, what did God do here? What did God, the Creator, do in this particular realm of biology or whatever it is, rather than trying to find some magic mathematical formula or mechanism that leads to the rise of life on the planet. Because they're never going to find that. It's the wrong way to pursue science. And like you said, science deals in the realm of the material world, and God is spirit. So science can never really answer the question of whether God exists. Although some people who are scientists talk about those things, but when they do so, they're more acting as philosophers or advancing a more of a religious belief than they are true science. There can never be a contradiction between real science and our faith.
Well, let's dive into that a little bit, right? Because not so long ago, I was down at the farmer's market, which I know some of you host a booth there or patronize regularly. I was down there with St. Paul Street Evangelization, and we were handing out some crucifixes, offering to pray for some people, da-da-da. I see this dude booking it down the sidewalk in a suit and a tie, not looking as handsomely as you guys, but he's booking it down the sidewalk, suit and tie, he's going, and he buys like a scone, and then he starts to run the other way. And I'm there in my mindset, it's an evangelization mode type mindset, right? So I'm thinking, this guy looks interesting. I want to see if I can stop him for a second. So I said, hey, you look like a millennial. Can you take a picture of us? And he wasn't offended, because millennials are like, yeah, I'm a millennial. So he comes over and takes a picture of us. I get his number. He says, yeah, I used to be Catholic, because we were handing out rosaries or whatever. I was like, and then he said, I stopped believing when I was in second grade. Wow. I don't know what I was believing in second grade, but I wasn't making existential decisions about the universe. Anyway, so he gives me his number, and we meet up afterwards. And we had a conversation, and his thought on why he no longer believed in God was basically this. How can I be confident that God exists since he's beyond my perception of space and time? So he's like, look, John, we're sitting here in this coffee shop, right? Yeah. We're sitting down at a table, which is occupying space in front of us. We're occupying space in front of each other. Time is going by as we're having this conversation. That's how we're able to sort of intelligently know that the other person is there. And our rationalities are able to connect. Right? This is what happened, at least when women talk with each other. Guys sometimes just grunt. A guy can say as much in a grunt as some women can say in 100 words. It's an amazing scientific phenomenon, which we don't have time to get into. So he's like, space and time, it's taking it up. This is how we're perceiving each other. So how can I know that God exists for sure? Like Matt just made a pretty huge posit. Did you catch that before, guys? He said, I'm more confident that the invisible God exists. I'm more confident about that than that you people are here. Okay? So this guy that I'm meeting with, Ryan, he's challenging that. He's saying, how can Christians be so sure that God exists since he's beyond our perception of space and time?
I could respond to that. Is it possible to put that image of the cosmos up on the slide to help with my visual aid? So perhaps this individual you're talking about understands God is the possibility of a cosmic force, an impersonal cosmic force, and truly God is radically transcendent. When you look at that image of each one of those, Dan will probably explain it better, but those are, instead of the real bright ones are stars, the other ones are galaxies filled with billions of stars. And so in a sense, God is so far beyond us, infinite. And we are finite, and God is mysterious. He's almost unknowable. But then you look back there at the crucifix on the wall, and you realize God is also radically immanent. He not only is out there, but he's right here dwelling in my heart. And even back to, you think back when God tested our human nature in Adam and Eve. Adam and Eve are, in other words, the sample of humanity that God tested when he wanted to know our human nature. What did they rebel against? They rebelled against God's radical transcendence by trying to grasp at God and become God in preference to God or in place of God, creating their own reality and deciding for themselves what was right and wrong. And then when that didn't work out, they tried to hide from God, which is a rebellion against his radical immanence. And you can't hide from God because it is in him that we live and move in our being. And I've experienced this in my own life, maybe everyone has. We rebel against this reality of who God is, and there's this tension. God is both not here and right here. And Bishop Barron says to grasp that tension is to have the most adequate understanding of God, of the one who is.
Yeah, and I think your millennial friend had two very common misconceptions that I see a lot with people that don't think about God very much or don't believe that he exists. One of them is that, and I'll just kind of referring to that picture, one of them is that God put those galaxies there and then left them. And that those galaxies just keep evolving according to the laws of nature, and God has nothing to do with it anymore. And then you ask yourself the question, well, if they're evolving without God having anything to do with it, maybe we don't need God at all. And this is one of the fallacies that people have. It's the clockmaker universe, I call it. God is the clockmaker. He just built the clock, and then he just wound it up, and now it just runs on its own. But I don't think that's the Catholic belief. In fact, I know it's not, because I haven't read all the catechism, but I've read a chunk of it, and paragraph 301 says, with creation, God does not abandon his creatures to themselves. He not only gives them being and existence, but also, and at every moment, upholds and sustains them in being. Those galaxies are there because God wills them to be at every moment of every day. That's the Catholic belief. And I've come to believe that for a number of reasons, but one of them is faith, but I think that's the most consistent way to understand the laws of the universe in my mind.
Can you go back to that slide of the galaxy far, far away?
Yeah.
All right, so what is this picture from? Could you just describe it for us? Let's just have a coolness factor here.
All
Also,
right,
gentlemen, be careful about sliding your chairs back.
Yeah, I'm getting
Other
close to
people are
the
probably thinking about it too. He's 2 inches away from an encounter with the ground, gravity, as it were. The laws of nature about to play out here on the stage. Yikes.
So this is a picture from the new Webb Space Telescope, which was first conceived when I was in graduate school in the 90s, and I was delighted to see they finally built it and put it in space 25 years later. Only 25 years behind schedule too. So that everything that has 6 spikes on it is a star, because those are diffraction spikes. The mirrors on the Webb are hexagon shaped, so they produce 6-sided stars when you image stars. But when you image galaxies, they come out with no spikes because they're diffuse objects. So everything that doesn't have 6 spikes on it in that picture is a galaxy, and this is a tiny little sliver of the sky. they just stared at the blankest, most boring part of the sky they could find, and they opened up the shutter on that telescope camera and just stared at it for hundreds and hundreds of hours, collecting 1, 2, 3 photons at a time. So these are all very, very distant galaxies. And it gives you a sense of how truly enormous the universe is. This is, each one of those things is a galaxy, and a galaxy contains roughly 100 billion stars, and there are roughly 100 billion galaxies, probably more, in our observable universe. So,
can you just dumb this down for people like me? So how big is the Milky Way galaxy? I know that much. We're in the Milky Way galaxy, everybody. If you didn't know that, well, Dan could tell us about it. How big is the Milky Way galaxy relative to other galaxies? Small, big?
Our galaxy is, it's a spiral galaxy, so it's bigger than many other galaxies, but there are galaxies 1,000 times bigger than the Milky Way. So the units, believe it or not, in actual professional astronomers, the units they use to measure distance is, anybody want to guess? No, centimeters. Yeah, when they do actual calculations, the astronomers use CGS units, so centimeters, grams, and seconds. I don't know why, because the numbers come out truly, truly enormous when you measure everything in centimeters. But yeah, so a more convenient unit would be a light year. So light goes around the equator of the Earth 7 times in 1 second. It's very fast. Takes 8 whole minutes to get from the Earth to the Sun, or to the Sun to the Earth. Takes about 4.2 years to get from the nearest star to us. And our galaxy is about 100,000 light years across. So that's just one of 100 billion galaxies in our universe. So Yeah.
Okay, 93 million miles. Okay, so it's kind of because we can understand miles, right? We kind of get that. And you just said our galaxy across edge to edge is how far?
It's about 100,000 miles. So 100,000 light years, sorry.
100,000 light years. Okay.
So,
wow.
So that I was going to mention the second problem your millennial friend might have is this one of what to do with
Ryan. He has a name.
Ryan.
Dan,
okay, he's got a name. If he's here, sorry, I didn't know your name. Did you invite him?
I thought about it and then I forgot. Real story.
Okay. So
I forgot his name until right now.
Okay, so Ryan might be thinking, what do we make of all this? This enormous amount of space, of just enormous scales of the universe compared to our tiny little planet. And there's 2 ways you can look at it. One is, it's, we're insignificant, and the universe is what's important, we're not. But I think a better way to look at it is, if and it's difficult to put yourself in the place of God, but if God wanted to make us aware of His glory and majesty, what better way to do it than to create this universe that's just obviously so much larger than ourselves? This was all created by God as a testament to His glory and majesty. And I urge you to start looking at the universe that way, because I think there's going to be a lot of scientists that get to heaven, and if they get a chance to talk to God, hopefully they do, they're going to say, "Why didn't you tell me you existed?" And God's going to say, He's going to slap his forehead, and He's going to say, "Didn't you ever look up at the sky? Didn't you notice this sign that I put in our universe? It's enormous. I am God. I created this." And once you flip that switch in your brain and you start thinking that way, That's a wonderful way to confront the world around us, I think. And it's really helped me.
Yeah, thank you for that, Dan. True story. The genesis or the idea behind this talk tonight was Steve and Ives, Dan and I, driving in the car back from La Crosse on a winter evening. It gets dark out early. I'm looking up at the stars, and I've got an astronomer in the back seat, so I took advantage of that. And he's telling me these things. I'm just like, dang. Like, you ever just look up at the sky on a dark night and you see the stars, and we're like, wow. How many stars did you say is in the Milky Way?
100 billion.
100 billion. How many galaxies are there about?
About 100 billion galaxies. So.
Okay.
And each galaxy has 100 billion stars, roughly.
It's hard to even grasp what that means, but just that sort of seismic sense of things is truly astonishing.
Yeah.
Well, so go ahead.
Would you be able to throw that Stephen Hawking quote up there at this point? And
sure.
Because we're talking about this huge concept of the universe, and it can make you feel a little insignificant.
Yeah, and I think this is
that's certainly what some people think.
Yeah, I'll just read it if you want. So Stephen Hawking said this in an interview, 95. He's since had a chance to talk to God about this. I think he passed away a couple years ago. But the human race, he said, the human race is just a chemical scum on a moderate-sized planet orbiting around an average star in the outer suburb of one among 100 billion galaxies. We are so insignificant that I can't believe the whole universe exists for our benefit. That would be like saying that you would disappear if I closed my eyes.
Yeah, so contrary to what Mr. Hawkins has to say, when I look at it, at the cosmos, it is impressive, but every one of you in this room has a power and a significance that's greater than all the stars combined. You have the ability to choose. That's something no star can do. You have the power of free will. And so in that sense, the universe can be viewed more or less as a stage on which we've been placed to make choices. And it is impressive, but it's not nearly as impressive as a single human being alive on this planet.
You guys ever think about that? We just talked about the seismic, astonishing size and marvel of the universe that we can begin to perceive, and that each one of you is infinitely. We're astonished by this. Why? Because it's like a doorway into infinity for us. It's not truly infinite, but it seems infinite based on our experience, what we're used to sort of measuring our experience in the world with, right? So that's why it astonishes us. What's more astonishing, right? Have you thought about what Matt said, that as you sit here on these uncomfortable plastic chairs, you're infinitely more valuable than the entire universe.
Not only that, but the entire universe is going to pass away, and your soul is still going to exist. Each one of you has an immortal soul. It's a spiritual being. It's not composed of parts. And so, after death, the body and soul are separated. Your soul is still going to exist long after the universe is gone.
Yeah, and I think our evidence, like I said, you also need to confront Scripture and salvation history. And I think our evidence that God loves us and that we are as valuable enough for this entire universe to exist is the fact that God himself came down and sacrificed himself on the cross for the redemption of our sins. He loves us.
There's an example, everybody, of that tension that Matt talked about before, right? The transcendence of God, which we can start to take sort of a peek at when we look at the universe. We see the transcendent nature of the universe, which is created by a transcendent God, but then also the immanence of God, the closeness, right? If you're not familiar with that word. We have God who astonishingly, for just one of you, would happily create all the universe and millions of universes for you, just for your marvel. And then he'd also, the immanent side of that, he also took on flesh lived a dusty life, as rough hands as a carpenter, and died being nailed to a tree for you. This is the infinite love of God. You can see this sort of the harmony of God's love, both in its magnificence and in its radical, strange suffering. On the topic of like time and God and sort of the confusions of my friend Ryan, an atheist might push back though with what you're saying of, well, God he just stepped into time and like what is time? What do we even mean by that, right? So how does God, think about this guys, how does God, whose nature transcends, right, goes beyond space and time and our material world, how does God use then our material world to reveal himself to us? How do we know that these revelations, because we talk, as Christians, we talk what? We talk pretty confidently about God. And in the same breath we say, yeah, he also transcends everything that we could possibly use as a vehicle for knowing about him. Does that make, so that connection there, right? So we're saying in the both breaths, in one breath rather, that God reveals himself to us in space and time, but also, by the way, God operates beyond space and time. How do we make sense of that?
Well, one word that comes into my head when you ask that question is just beauty. We can observe not only in the cosmos, but even right here on Earth, beauty. And sometimes you can look at a flower and you can think, well, what is the purpose of a flower? I mean, obviously they're vibrant colors to attract a pollinator, but why such a huge variety? Why a seemingly endless variety of color and configuration of flowers? Wouldn't just a couple bright colors serve the purpose? And because the reality is, things have, the two poles of existence are both purpose and meaning. So some things don't necessarily have a purpose, but they have meaning. And so what is the meaning? What is the purpose? The meaning of that which is alive is to live, is to bring forth its essence and to bloom as the natural manifestation of the living God. And so you can see evidence of God even in his created world. And that's sometimes the atheists will say, well, what about this or that? There's no purpose to that. Not everything has a purpose, but it has meaning.
You give any other examples? Have you thought of that distinction, everybody? The difference between things that exist of having purpose and having meaning. Are there other examples that you guys could give that might help unpack that?
Well, our lives have purpose and meaning. Our lives, and you can see people who don't have a purpose or meaning in their life. And if you get to my age, 58, you've observed this many times.
You're 58?
Yeah.
I thought you were 38.
I was 20 years ago.
What is time?
If I was on a rocket ship traveling near the speed of light, I would only still be 38. But unfortunately, I've been right
That's
here
crazy.
in this
Everybody's
inertial frame of reference of
Everybody's
Earth.
getting like a
Same
Bowflex
as
and
you.
Botox, but all they need to do is travel at the speed of light. How come
That's all
nobody's
there is
doing
to
this?
it. You never age. What were we talking about
I
again?
don't know. I'm thinking about Botox now.
Purpose and meaning. So if you see people who are battling addictions or depression or anxiety, sometimes there's physiological aspects to that, but sometimes too it comes with this idea they just don't know what their purpose and their meaning is. So the purpose of life, as taught by our Catholic Church, is to know and to love and to serve God. But again, like the meaning is the same as basically as the flower, is to exist, because we have a right to, and to live, and to be that natural manifestation of the living God. And so, purpose and meaning are the two poles of our existence. And one quote I remembered from reading a passage from the early Christians. It goes like this. It says, if they ask you what is the sign of the Father in you, tell them it is movement and repose. And you can see that movement and repose, that purpose and meaning, that tension and resolution. It's like we breathe in and then we exhale. Our heart contracts and then it relaxes. It's like the whole universe has got this sort of rhythm to it. And it's just because it's an imprint and an image of the Creator.
Yeah, and I think Genesis is correct in that creation was created for life and for the pinnacle of his living creation, which is man. And I see that in what I understand about cosmology.
Definition time. What is cosmology? Cosmetics is when, like, I put on makeup before coming here, right?
That's cosmetology.
Oh, okay.
That's a shorter degree. If you want to be a cosmologist, you're gonna have to go to school a little longer.
I want to apologize on behalf of Our Lady of the Falls if any of you are cosmetologists. Is that what it is?
Yeah,
Dan
cosmetologist.
insulting your career?
But
No, I'm kidding.
that's a skill too, which I don't have. I cut my kid's hair last couple days ago, and he hasn't left the house since. So, in my understanding of cosmology, I've seen lots of indications that the universe has peculiar sort of fine tuning to it, where it couldn't possibly have gotten to the point where it's at now unless it were carefully constructed from the beginning. For example, in the beginning of the universe, it was in a highly ordered state. This is not a theological belief. This is a physical belief that cosmologists have determined. The universe started off in a highly ordered state. It's very difficult to get it to the size that it is now unless everything is launched with absolute precision from the beginning. There's some other things too.
How would we know that? How would we know that at the beginning the universe was ordered, as you say, and not random? By the way, as I'm asking a question, I remind you here now, if you have any questions and you want to write them down on the card, our ushers here in a couple seconds will just file the aisles, as it were, to grab those. So you got maybe a couple minutes to stump our guys up here.
Yeah, I mean, if you go to this picture of the universe, if it hadn't been highly ordered to begin with, this would be just like a screen full of static. All of the matter of the universe would just be a gas of roughly even density everywhere. It'd be the most boring universe ever. And there's other things that you notice too. Carbon, for example, only exists by this sort of miraculous resonance in the nucleus of carbon that allows it to form at all. And if you study, if you read about the latest speculations on physics by theoretical physicists themselves, and the current understanding that's kind of emerged, it's crazy. It's that there are an infinite number of universes, and the reason ours is so special is because if it weren't, we wouldn't be here to observe it. That's the anthropic principle.
The what?
The anthropic principle. So it's the principle that the universe is the way it is because otherwise we wouldn't be here to observe it. And there's a huge amount of criticism of that because that's not science. That's religion. That's saying there's this infinite number of other universes that we can never observe or know anything about, and that's why ours is so special. Well, I got another theory as to why our universe is so special. It's because it was purposefully created. So I think there is evidence of a purposeful universe, that there is a teleology to the universe, and And we are the recipients of a great gift from God. And so, so I think it's not unscientific to say the universe is special because it has a purpose. It was created specifically for man, as we believe as Catholics.
Thank you very much. So brownie point moment, he just said a word, teleology. What does that mean again? He said the teleology of the universe. At the beginning we said this word, it's a Greek word.
The end.
The end, very good. Can somebody get her a brownie, please? Okay, so they'll be bringing these up shortly. Can I press in, if it's okay, Matt and Dan, to that point about time again? So how do we're in time, we're kind of trapped in time. We can't get away from it. Like, try to imagine getting out of our state of being. We can close our eyes, we can go in an airplane, we can jump off of a cliff. Turns out we're still trapped in the time-bound realities of the material world. How can we be confident that, how can we even know that God's a Trinity, for example? How does time and our experience, but time and faith too, intersect?
Well, I'll just say quickly that in physics, time is just a parameter. It's just a variable. We know nothing about it beyond that. And
what do you mean by that?
It's just a number. It's just a variable that appears in our equations. If you write down the equations for a cannonball being fired from a cannon, you can adjust the time to see where the cannonball will be, either in the future or in the past. But our experience of time is not that you can just randomly go in the future or in the past. It just marches unceasingly forward, and we have no idea why. So I will just say, physics has no answer to that question, but theology probably does. But I'm going to defer to Matt.
Well, I don't know how fast I could go through it, but I could go through that slide if you wanted to put that up there, and I'll try to move quickly because it's already 10 after, but...
So we'll do Q&A at about 20 to 25 after. We'll have a solid 20 minutes for that.
So this is my simple-minded chart demonstrating sort of the landscape of the Catholic idea of reality. I've divided it up into two broad categories of spirit and matter. And what I'm trying to do is work down to time and give it some context. So in the created world, we have spirit and matter. So angels, the souls of human beings, are spirit, and our bodies in the material world are matter or material. And God is spirit. God knows the universe into existence. So spirit is that which has the power of intellect and will for knowing and loving. Material world is that which does not have those powers. Sense perceptible, occupies space. The material world is also composed of parts, so that's how it occupies space, spreads its parts out in space, whereas a spiritual being has no parts, and that's kind of a key thing to grasp as far as a difference. So because the material world is composed of parts, it can undergo substantial change, which means change of nature, or its essence, or its underlying reality can undergo a change. But a spiritual being cannot undergo that type of change. It would undergo what a philosopher would refer to as an accidental change. So a change of knowledge or love, affections, or operations, but not a change to its actual substance. God, by definition, does not change. He is unchangeable. And sometimes we perceive God as changing, like we think of God as love or mercy, but it's us who changes, not God. He is just love. He is responding to every choice we make with perfect love. but we experience God differently depending on what we're choosing at any given time. Our experience of God might be love as mercy in one instance or as justice in another. And so, because of the nature of material, it has a very precarious hold on its being, whereas spiritual angels and the souls of human beings have a more tenacious hold on being, but God is being itself. And so when you ask about does God exist, it's actually kind of an awkward question. God is existence in the very broad sense of understanding. God is infinite existence, existence itself. And as far as the Trinity, the infinite divine nature is wholly expressed as existence in God the Father. In the infinite divine nature is wholly expressed as knowledge in God the Son, and wholly expressed as lovingness as God the Holy Spirit. And so, part of this idea of time now, we're getting closer to this. Any beings that are not God, angels, human beings, and even material, possess their being as a succession. In other words, what I was last year and what I am now and what I'll be hopefully tomorrow is all a part of who I am. I possess my being in a succession. God, again by definition, possesses his whole being simultaneously and by necessity. He is non-contingent.
Can you just say that again?
Non-contingent being.
Okay.
He is necessary because of reality.
So I don't know if I've ever thought about it that way. So difference between God and us, God possesses his whole being in an ever-present moment. Could we even use that word?
Well, that's part of the problem. Our language is not really adequate to describe God, really. Because we speak in tenses, we speak in past, present, or future tense, but none of those things really apply to God because he's eternal. So we just have to make the best with what we can, with the language that we have. So the best term that I've seen in theological books is that God possesses being simultaneously, all at once. And that's what eternity is. It's outside time, and it's an eternal now. Matter, as Dan said, time is related to matter. It's related to change. One definition, the duration of that which changes, but duration kind of speaks of time. It's kind of a fundamental thing that defies definition because it is so fundamental. But it always relates to change. And so St. Thomas Aquinas suggested that spiritual beings don't exist in time, and there's no time in heaven. But we're also not going to be, strictly speaking, in eternity, because in eternity there's no beginning, and we obviously all had a beginning. So he used the word aviternity to describe this sort of in-between eternity and time. And I think it has to do with the idea of approaching eternity or imperfect eternity. And there's one other thing that comes up with this idea of God being outside time. Sometimes this question comes up. If God is outside time, and if he knows what I'm going to do in the future, in what sense do I have a free will if God already knows what I'm going to do? I don't know if anybody has that question, but we do have another slide to answer that question if anybody seems like that is something that bothers them.
Do you want to see that on the slide?
Yeah, why don't we spend a couple minutes on that slide, and then we have plenty of questions here to carry us the rest of the way.
Yeah, we didn't get Frank Sheed's name up there, but this is a quote from Frank Sheed addressing that question about God's foreknowledge or his foreseeing. So God is intimately present with the space extension and the time succession of all creatures. not beside, nor parallel, nor before or after, but present in and with them, sustaining them, cooperating with them, and therefore seeing, not foreseeing what they may do at any particular point of the space extension or any instant of the time succession in which they may exist or operate. So that takes a few times to read through that. For me, like maybe several dozen times before it started to sink in. And it's hard to really reduce it down to any simpler explanation, because when you're dealing with things like God's eternity, it requires us to kind of elevate our minds rather than to drag down the concepts to our level. But
So is this a fitting example, right? So this, if I drop this, it's going to take however much time to reach the ground, and we observe that, and he's using the phrase time succession, like this succeeded in time from a foot off the table to on the table. Is that an example?
The bottle cap possesses its being in its succession. So its being is here in its space and time. So it doesn't possess its whole being all at once, but as its succession. And so it has to do with both space and time.
Did you say that last part again?
Well,
I think you're hitting it. Like a space extension that we could get, right? That's if I flick this out and I hit Luke's forehead with it, right? We could try it.
Yeah, go ahead and try it. See how good. Whoa, that was pretty close. That was nice.
Ma'am, I'm so sorry. That was, yeah. Okay, so is that an example of space extension? You're saying since it's a bottle cap, it doesn't have the same qualities perhaps that a human being that also has a spiritual state?
Well, I mean, human beings are, like we said, we have our foot in both worlds. So our body is in time and our soul is not. But because we have a fallen nature, our body is sort of dragging our soul down into time. And that's part of why we're so messed up, I think. Mm-hmm. When we die, our body and soul will be separated, and we'll be reunited with a glorified body that won't be in time. And so then we'll be back on track. But we suffered a certain disintegration when we fell from grace. And part of that is now our bodily passions have too much influence on our whole being, dragging it sort of into time.
Yeah, exclusively almost, right? Where we live moment to moment, pleasure to pleasure, movie to movie, swipe to swipe, job to job, right? Have you ever thought about this when we say, oh, I'm bored, right? Maybe you've heard of Saint Jose Maria Escriva. His famous quote on when people would come to him saying, I'm so bored, Father, I don't know what to do with my life. There were no cell phones, so apparently people were bored. Not like today, right? Sarcasm. Right, so they came to him, they came and said, I'm bored. And he said, listen, you're bored because your body is awake and your soul is asleep. Guys, if we're ever bored, like, there's nothing to do. Well, what an ironic moment. That was my cell phone. I think it's a sign. See, God does exist. Right? I'm bored. We have these sort of, they're almost like self-treatments. We numb ourselves to this sort of scary feeling of boredness, where it feels like we might not have a purpose. Right? So insofar as we're disconnected with our purpose, which is what? To live as a child of God here on this earth, to know Him, to love Him, to serve Him, so that we can live forever with Him in heaven. If we're not connected daily, moment to moment, with God, to that purpose, everybody, what happens? Without that purpose, without that mission, if you will, we find ourselves in our space and our time bored, floating around somewhat meaninglessly, vulnerable to all sorts of things to think and feel or do or say. Okay? The devil loves this, by the way. You can read the Screw Tape Letters from C.S. Lewis to learn a little bit more about a perspective of Satan on that. But St. Jose Maria Escriva, if you can take that to the bank, You're bored whenever your body is awake, but your soul, your spirit, what is eternally significant about you, is asleep. You're bored because your body is awake and your soul's asleep. Dan, anything that you'd want to add to that, piggybacking off of Matt? Should we dive into questions?
Well, my wife asked me the other night, how can an angel be can they be in two cities at once? And, and do they experience time the way we do? And I said, I don't know, because we didn't study the physics of angels in graduate school, but I have a book recommendation, which is, if you read the Confessions by St. Augustine, he's notorious for going on digressions. And about 2/3 of the way through, just for no reason at all, he just writes an entire chapter on the philosophy of time and talks about time succession. So that's my recommendation. So.
St. Augustine.
But to answer the
Confessions.
question about angels, I would just say this: spirit is
Yeah, I
where
should have said
spirit
ask
acts. Spirit doesn't occupy space in the sense that matter does, but spirit is where it acts. So in that sense,
Okay, what?
our
Say that again.
soul is everywhere in our body by action, but not in a physical sense, occupying space.
Is that an example of the sort of image of God, his eminence, sort of his presence to us?
Well, God is acting everywhere because he's holding everything that exists in existence. But then other created spirits also act within the universe. So yeah, angelic beings can act in the physical world. Just like our soul can move the physical part of our body, so can other spiritual beings affect material things, which can be scary if you start talking about exorcisms and possession, but also just affecting weather patterns. And so I don't know if we can get into this question, because I don't know what the questions are, but I know one big question that leads a lot of times to atheism. One of the biggest things that people have a problem with about God is this idea: if God is all powerful and all knowing and all loving, why does he allow an innocent child to suffer? And that leads a lot of people, because they say, well, he knows about it, he should be able to do something about it, and he's love, so why do I see this child dying from cancer? And I think that's a huge question, and I don't know if I'll get a chance to address it, but why did I start talking about that again?
Well, that's a whole topic in itself.
I don't know. It is
The Twilight Zone with Dan and Matt.
yeah. It is a big question that people have, and it is hard to answer, and it takes a little bit of development, and ultimately my ideas might not ring true with everybody, but atheism certainly has no answer for it, but the Catholic Church at least has something to say about it.
Yeah. Well, he just asked the biggest question, and let me just read the first question here. If God is all-powerful and all-loving, why does he allow innocent children to suffer?
I don't think it says that. Did you really
Is
look
that the wrong
through
one? People probably want to, let's spend 3 minutes or something unpacking that a little bit, and then let's get to some, because you just asked the biggest question in the history of philosophy and religion. Not that these aren't big questions, everybody. They're very good. But what might be the beginning, at least? The beginning sort of glance of a Christian's response to that?
Well, in my response, I wanted to also talk about a little bit of quantum mechanics, so maybe before I respond, we could get Dan to explain the mystery of quantum entanglement, because I think people would, if they've never heard of that, would really find it interesting.
And how about this? How about we circle back to the question?
It's also part of my answer.
Okay.
Because God isn't just out in the...
I think you wanted
He
a
isn't
3-minute
out
answer.
just in the cosmos. He's also in the microscopic reality that we find even at the level of quantum physics.
Let me make a note here and see if we can get back to the problem of suffering. Technically, it's not what we're dealing with tonight necessarily.
No.
But, Dan, anything you want to add here before we actually get to some questions?
Well, I think we should just go to the question. I think that would kind of lead us pretty far astray in the time we have.
Probably so.
Yeah.
Probably so. At least in terms of the questions that came in. Here's an idea for another Catholicism on tap, perhaps. Okay. I don't know where to start. There's a lot of really good ones here. Let's see. Do you think that Earth is the only planet with intelligent life? Or intelligent life with a soul? Or do you think there is life somewhere else out there? And if there is, this is a second question, so I'll marry these two questions if I may. So do you think the planet, excuse me, our planet is the only planet with intelligent life, intelligent spiritual life? If it is, and there's aliens out there, does that change our conception of like where we came from? What if there were aliens that were more powerful than us that were able to create what we perceive as the universe?
Well, I think my sense of the answer to that question might be a little different than NASA's, and the reason I say that is because from a scientific perspective, we've been confronting the issue of abiogenesis. How does life arise from non-life? And for an atheistic understanding of the universe, you have to come up with a way that could happen. It's not impossible that the atoms that make up Matt could self-assemble by accident, but obviously that's pretty improbable. So we've been, scientists have been studying this problem for 100 years, and the abiogenesis conventions are the saddest conventions in all of science because nobody has any idea how that happened, and nobody can figure out a reasonable way how that could have happened by accident. But I was mentioning before this goofy sort of modern physics theory that we live in an infinite number of universes. Well, there's a solution right there. There's an infinite number of universes, so it happened somewhere, and we live in the one where it happened. But there's a consequence to that. If that's your answer to the question, there's a consequence to that. The consequence is we are alone. If it's that improbable, then we're it for the universe. So I tend to, based on the failure of our search for extraterrestrial intelligence, I tend to lean towards the idea that we are the only life in the universe. Earth is it. And I know NASA doesn't agree with that, but I think the reason they disagree with that is because how are you going to sell a $5 billion space probe to Congress if you can't say, well, we're going to find life. We're going to Europa and we're going to find life. Well, there's probably no life there, but we'll give you $5 billion anyway. So I'm actually kind of skeptical of that, and I think we probably are alone in the universe. And I've seen more and more scientists, for scientific reasons, come to that same conclusion. So I think the second part of the question was, what if they do exist?
Yeah, if there's other life in this universe or multi-universes, does that challenge a Christian's conception of the need for a creator?
Well, 50 years ago, the answer was, the scientific answer or the scientific consensus was that it was, it probably is, there probably is life in the universe. There's a lot of space out there and a lot of planets. I think that's changing now, but back when people were more optimistic about it, the Catholic Church and scientists associated with the Catholic Church did some studies and looked into this and asked themselves the question, what would we do if we found an alien civilization? Well, I guess my question is, what would God do? Would he send a savior to them as well? Or would we have to introduce them to our Savior, the Savior of all of life in the universe? I don't know. And but Catholics have thought about this question. So you can go on a website like the Society of Catholic Scientists, and you can find some articles where people have speculated about how would we confront aliens as Catholics, if that were to happen. But I sort of suspect that's not going to come up. I don't know what Matt thinks of that. But think there's aliens out there?
I honestly haven't thought a lot about it and don't really have a strong opinion about it. I tend to think not so, but if we discovered life, I don't see it affecting my faith. So I think we still need to have this absolute being that's causing everything else.
Right. Next question here. I've heard different opinions on how old the Earth is. Does it matter? Is it more faith and scripture related or scientifically related? Why do some people get so hung up about this?
Well,
Tension in the room suddenly rose. Are they creationists or evolutionists?
Yeah. So I don't think it matters, because I think someone asking that question is trying to interpret Genesis, right? And I think if you're trying to interpret Genesis, you have to remember that Genesis is the story of man's relationship to God. In fact, the whole Bible is a continuation of that story. And everything it tells you about man's relationship to God is true. And there are, and if you look at the creation story in Genesis, it has some words and terminology that makes it familiar to people, so people will understand it. It talks about a week. It talks about days. It talks about God working 6 days and resting. These are things that would have been familiar to the people hearing that story. But I would just encourage people to okay. So I'm gonna tell you a story about somebody named Georges Lemaitre. Georges Lemaitre was a Catholic priest, Belgian Catholic priest, and he's actually the person that came up with the story or the theory of the Big Bang in the first place. He noticed that galaxies were receding from the Earth, and he studied Einstein's theory of gravity, and he put 2 and 2 together, and he published a paper. He says, well, the universe is expanding, so at some point in the past it must have been a very small point. I think I actually have a slide on it. Somewhere. Yeah. So that law is now called the Lemaitre-Hubble law. That predicts that the further away a galaxy is, the faster it's moving away from us. And it does that because the universe is expanding. And for all of my lifetime, it's been called the Hubble law, because 2 years after Father Lemaitre came up with this theory in 1927, George Hubble did some measurements and published that graph there. And so they gave all the credit to Hubble. I think part of the problem that scientists had with this theory was that it sounded too Catholic. Does that sound strange to you guys? This was, in the 1920s, people were kind of enamored with Marxism and atheism and
Fortunately, not anymore.
yeah. And so, but here's this Catholic priest that came up with this idea that the universe was created. And, whoa, that sounds really Catholic. So the guy that named it the Big Bang was Fred Hoyle. He was a staunch believer in the steady state theory, that the universe is eternal, it hasn't changed ever. Kind of a militant atheist, because he thought, well, if the universe is eternal, I don't have to think about where it came from. I don't think that's true. I think you still have to say where even an eternal universe came from, but we now know, thanks to Father Lemaitre, that it had a beginning. And in 1950, Pope Pius XII he was so thrilled that one of his priests had made this phenomenal scientific discovery that he gave a talk about. Father Lemaitre has proven Luke's fiat, let there be light, right from Genesis. And Father Lemaitre said, he actually met with the Pope and says, I recommend against making claims like that. At the time, the theory was still controversial. It's not controversial today, we've discovered. Basically, the fireball from the Big Bang. But I think Georges Lemaitre had a good point. Let's not take Genesis and compare it with science and try to use one to prove the other. Because science is one category, and Scripture and faith are a different category. And I think it's fine to keep those two separate.
Distinct, perhaps.
Distinct,
Probably
yeah.
not separate, right? Because they
Yeah.
intersect continually, but the distinction between them.
Yeah.
Thank you for that. Matt, anything you'd add?
Not really. I just think that there's a lot more important things we learn from the Genesis narrative than the actual date of creation. There's time that it just doesn't seem for me personally to, it's not going to affect the way I live my life to know whether the universe is 15 billion years or 6,000 years. How is that going to change what I'm doing today? And to me, the most two important times in my life are right now and the hour of my death. So what I do at any moment in my life determines the state of my soul at the hour of my death, whether I have sanctifying grace or not. And knowing the exact date of creation isn't really going to factor in there too much. It would be interesting to know. But
Yeah, right. I think some of the
But it's not as
concern-
important as what we do learn from Genesis,
Yeah, I
that
think
God
some of the-
created the universe,
Right.
that everything he created was good. He created man, male and female, and so on. Those are the things that determine how we live our lives.
Yes, right. So isn't it true that insofar as we're rooted in that reality or that telos? He's the Greek scholar.
Yeah.
I always get a little nervous when I say words that come from Greek because, like, Dan, he's judging me silently behind those PhD glasses. Right. So Christians, that's a principal concern, everybody. Because I think what some people are concerned about, reasonably so, is okay. Well, if we give way to an evolutionary mode of thinking, in other words, everything is just sort of material developing in front of us and sort of a social evolutionism, a spiritual evolutionism predicated on a natural evolutionism, then we get into some dangerous waters. Well, then we get into, well, there's not really any kind of spiritual substance or reality. Everything is kind of changing. Transgenderism. You can be what you want. You want to wake up tomorrow and file taxes as a kitty cat? Go for it. If it leads to that way of thinking, that's a problem. That's a problem, obviously. So we want, and the church teaches clearly on this, no, right? Because that leads us to a non-real way of experiencing and believing about the universe. However, the distinction that the church always makes, and this and other subtle points, everybody, is subtle. The church doesn't command us how to believe how old or young the earth is. It commands us to believe in the creed, which is our salvation. Jesus is our salvation, right? So those distinctions, again, might be helpful in terms of not confusing categories of errant philosophies that lead to atheism and hedonism. Okay, being able to pull that out of it and be like, well, there's still truth here to what Father Lemaitre and science seems to indicate. Now, we don't have, and there wasn't a question about it, but some people might ask the question of, well, what about microevolution versus macroevolution? Did we really come from apes and things like that? That, that's a subtle sort of sub-question of this, but it brings us still back to the fundamental question of, do these material things, observable or not, measurable, do they define who or what God's plan is?
Well, and I would give the one sentence answer to what do you have to say about the history of the natural world? I would say God created the world in the most spectacular way possible. That's my impression from what I've learned about science. So, again, he's making his glory and majesty obvious to us.
Thank you, Dan. Just as a reminder, as we're nearing here a quarter to the top of the hour, childcare will unleash your children to Olson's Ice Cream in the Candy Shop in approximately 3 minutes. So if you want to start to mosey that direction, we'll wrap up here in a few minutes otherwise. Here's a good mind-bending question. What about evidence? Put your thinking caps on here again, everybody. What about evidence for the spiritual realm? Is the spiritual realm a plane in our space and time? Is it 2D? Is it 3D? Is it 4D? Is it a dimension that's real and perceptible, but that we just can't perceive? Well, not perceptible if we can't perceive it, but what would you talk about the dimensions of how the spiritual realm exists? Does that question make sense?
Yeah. Well, and just for for evidence of the spiritual realm, we have spiritual manifestations, we have miracles, and we have the evidence of salvation history, the miracles of salvation history. And I would, I have a book recommendation. It's called They Flew by a Yale historian named Carlos Ire. And he talks about the history of St. Teresa of Avila and her levitations. Nobody's ever written about the history of this from a scholarly perspective. And he says if we apply the same rigor that we apply to other things, like did Emperor Julius Caesar exist, or did Alexander the Great actually make it all the way to India or something, we would conclude that St. Teresa of Avila levitated. And so I think there's this sort of natural skepticism that the spiritual world just doesn't really exist, and we have to preface all of our thought by, nope, that's impossible. Let's talk about what's possible. I think we have to also consider what's impossible under the laws of physics. So the question of where is the spiritual plane? If you ask a little kid where's hell, where do they point? Yeah, where's heaven? That's the pre-Copernican astronomy. Before Copernicus came along, the center of the universe, what was at the center of the universe? The earth was at the center. What was at the center of the earth? Hell. The worst place in the whole world, the whole universe to be before Copernicus came along was the center of the universe. So the thing that Copernicus did that annoyed the theologians was not that he took us away from a special place in the middle of the universe. It's that he put us into the heavens. He made us gods. That, and we've got it all backwards. Like, oh, Copernicus took us away from the center of the universe. Good. Nobody wants to be in the center of the universe. That's where hell is. But on the other hand, we don't want to consider ourselves gods. I would say, like I said, I haven't studied the physics of the spiritual world, but it's not a location in the space-time of our observable universe. It's something beyond the universe, or parallel to it, or it's a theological concept. And to talk about the location of the spiritual is, I think, I have no answer to that. Yeah.
Yeah, I think there's some confusion about this right now because you're talking about artificial intelligence and this idea that consciousness can arise by some sort of computer. It's kind of goes along with the idea that our consciousness arises as some sort of epiphenomenon of our brain, and And I think the Catholic worldview is no, it's actually idea is the ultimate reality. It's mind over matter. And so if you believe everything is reduced down to matter, then spirit, in other words, knowing and loving, are just the result of chemical reactions in our brain or electrical impulses. So this is any young gals in the audience, if you ever decide you want to date an atheist and he says, just know if he says I love you, all he's saying is I have chemical reactions going on in my brain and electrical impulses about you. Like,
Little
is
less
that
romantic,
what you really
Matt.
want? You know, so spirit, this question seems like it's trying to equate spirit into some way into the physical plane.
So it's like a reductionism. Can you share the image that you guys shared before of reductionism, like how you would study a car? How did you say that before?
Yeah, I think I was talking about all physics can tell you is what things are made of at the smallest level or at the most basic level. So, I mean, a physics answer to what is a car or what is Matt is we just make a list of the location and number and type of all the atoms in his body, but that doesn't tell you what a car is or what Matt is. You know, to get to that point, you have to study it emergently at a higher level. So that's what reductionism is. I mean, physicists will tell you, we're looking for a theory of everything. Well, you're looking for the reductionist theory of everything. You're trying to list all the molecules in the universe and explain exactly what they're made of, but that's the lowest level of being there. You haven't said anything about the level of being that is my everyday experience. You know, the planet and the life on this planet and the human beings walking around, and more importantly, the spiritual world and God.
So we're going to wrap here in a few. Just as a reminder, if you want to take any food, now would be a great time to do it because the food is otherwise going to be placed in a fridge and have an uncertain future in the space-time continuum unless you take it. Give it a certain home. Give it its destiny. All right, so let's think through this, everybody. We'll close with this. So God, Matt and Dan, if I'm understanding you, God is an immaterial being, an immaterial, eternal being, love, existence itself, right?
Except for, of course, God the Son took on human flesh and...
Okay, spoilers. Also, it didn't occur to me until right now that my kids are the only ones without a parent here watching them. So if you see them running around, I'm almost done, kids. Don't worry. Just a little question here. All right, so God is immaterial, immeasurable. We're just talking about heaven, right? Is it in the space? Can we find heaven somewhere? But Jesus, so we'd say no. However, what do we believe? So this is just like a little mind bender as we close here. But we believe that Jesus ascended soul and body into heaven. So does Jesus of Nazareth currently exist with his resurrected body? This wasn't scripted, by the way.
Yes.
Okay, so he does, right? Because he is who he is.
Just keep asking me yes/no questions, and I'll make it there.
All right. So how come if the resurrected Jesus, whose body, blood, soul, and divinity, if that still exists, if he still exists as the God-man, where's the man part of him? How come we can't find it? Where's Mary? Where's Elijah?
Or Enoch.
Or Enoch?
Yeah. I don't know. That's it's okay to have mysteries in your understanding of the world. I firmly believe that. I don't believe I will ever banish all mysteries from my understanding of the world, and I think that is a mystery.
Okay.
But maybe you've been taught differently.
Matt, any closing thoughts from you?
I would just say they're being assimilated into a higher existence.
They're assimilated into a higher existence, like one perhaps that we can't perceive now until we're also able to
Into
participate.
infinite existence. That's what we're made for. And we are finite, but we're made for the infinite. And so don't settle for anything less than infinite existence.
Yeah, there is such a thing as glorified existence, but the letters of Paul don't delve into the physics of glorified existence. So, I understand that we'll be changed. We'll be changed again at the resurrection. We'll be living in bodily form, but in a glorified way. But I think there's a limit to human understanding of how exactly that will look like. John will be even more handsome than he is now in his glorified form, most likely.
That'd be awesome.
Yeah.
We can close here maybe with a quote from Pope St. John Paul II. Some of you might be familiar with it, right? He was this wonderful theologian and philosopher. He had a PhD in both. And he, in talking about the tension in the contemporary world between reason or sort of rational scientific approaches to reality and belief, seemingly sort of being dichotomized against spiritual understandings of belief, he said this, and this is a paraphrase here, if you will. He says, faith and reason are like the two wings of a soaring eagle that bring us to the transcendent place that is God. Faith, good, and reason are like the two wings of a soaring eagle. We can't reach God. God doesn't intend for us to reach him with only faith and only religious convictions, or obviously with only material ones, but rather in proper integration of both. Thank you, gentlemen, for your time. Thank you guys for the great questions. I hope it was a fun night. Why don't we give them a round of applause?